Thank you for having me today. Let me start with this. So conflict is something that we all have in our lives with other people to varying degrees. And I think it's helpful to understand why conflict occurs before even thinking about conflict resolution as a approach to dealing with it. So conflict occurs when our needs, interests, values, or identities are threatened, or there's the perception that they're being threatened. And so right now we see this in our world, right? People, especially their identities are being threatened. Our needs are being threatened. Our interests are being threatened. Our values are being threatened, or there's that perception that that's occurring. And so conflict resolution is an approach to understanding what is going on, what are the fears and threats that people perceive or are very real for some people, right? And then how do we address those issues as we identify them in a constructive way that works towards some type of solution or resolution? So I think that's a relatively direct definition for like dealing with conflict from a resolution perspective. It's like understanding those needs, interests, values, and identities that are being threatened, or there's the perception that they're being threatened, and working through those to make sure that those needs are no longer threatened, those values are no longer threatened, those interests are no longer threatened, and that those identity related aspects are not being threatened as well. So I'll end there for now. Also, people project our own values and ideas about what is right and what is wrong into conflict situations. And so those can prevent us from working towards resolution, for one. And I think in terms of like the cognitive traps specifically, we get stuck in our positions of what are right and what is wrong. And when we get stuck there, we are then unable to listen to where the other person or other group is coming from. And so I think that deep listening to understand, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, is something that we struggle with, especially when we see someone as a wrong idea or wrong values or the wrong approach. And it's tricky because, you know, maybe there is something wrong about it, but as soon as we identify someone as being wrong or unjust or immoral or whatnot, then it's hard for us to really listen to their perspective, especially if it threatens, going back to that original statement, if it threatens our values or our identity or our needs. So there's a lot of other traps that we find ourselves in, but I think those are applicable to what we're experiencing right now.
Our youth today, when they're dealing with, I know we talked about toxic stress here in YODJ, but when youth are dealing with different things that are constantly at a high level for them, it's easier for them to get into a state in which it's hard to listen. And so it's easier to get to that conclusion where you're right and I'm wrong. One thing that we talked about in our discussion series was the ego. And we talked about what does the ego mean and how do we jump to these conclusions because we want to protect ourselves. And so it was interesting as we went, you know, we talked through a scenario of being on the basketball court and having someone rub you the wrong way or say the wrong thing and how quickly we are to jump to that conclusion. So, you know, as youth, we're constantly, you know, the students are constantly in spaces that conversation and communication is key. And it's very easy to elevate a conversation into a conflict. And so we talked about how do we take a step back What do we do prior to just initiating, I'm right and you're wrong?
I would say as a youth, the skills that I feel that we need to communicate with kids my age would be, number one, would be respect. Number two, I would say to understand our differences and realize that all of us won't be perfect. Another thing I would say is, excuse me. Another thing I would say is, we also have to understand the youth and understand like the different point of views of where different youth might come from. Because like you said earlier, different people have different backgrounds. So everybody might not have the same similar story or anything like that.
Because this plays into how we deal with conflict, how we resolve conflict. I would even say how we just like engage conflict. As we develop, like as we grow, you know, older, our minds develop, right? And there, historically, psychology has told us, you know, after the age of 21 to 25, we stop developing. But there's a lot of science right now that's showing that's absolutely wrong. We continue to develop. And so the older we are, the more capacity we have to tap into that emotional intelligence, to be more empathetic. That's not always the case. It's not perfect science. So for youth, a lot of times youth don't have the same perspective in the sense that they haven't developed it, and it's no fault of their own, right? We grow through, part of the ways that we grow and develop as people, as human beings, is by dealing with difficult situations and conflict, right? And so youth are at a point where like a lot of people, and Maria Montessori is really well known for talking about how like justice and right and wrong is really important to adolescents. And so like this idea of like, you're right, you're wrong, what's just, what's unjust is a framework that youth bring to these conversations, consciously or unconsciously. And I think encouraging youth to move beyond that right and wrong mentality, even though there is an element of right and wrong, right? Definitely, especially what we're seeing right now in the world. There is some harms and wrong that is being done, and we need to reconcile this and address it and change it, right? In our society, in our communities, etc. Adults, though, have a little bit more capacity for empathy because of where we're at developmentally, because of our experiences. But it's not to say that youth can't have that. Youth have a lot of capacity if they tap into it. If you guys tap into it consciously, if you're aware of it, if you really try to be empathetic and be active in that and listen deeply, and take other people's perspectives, right? Emmanuel was just talking about that, like really trying to understand where people are coming from. And you know, there's been a lot of talk, especially in emotional intelligence, in that field, about the importance of empathy. And I think that empathy is critical, but I think we need to also take it a step beyond empathy. And there's this concept called perspective taking, which empathy is about feeling what other people feel. That's a really simple way. I know that doesn't do it justice entirely, but perspective taking is about trying to think about where they're coming from, really trying to understand what they're saying and the experiences that they've had. And I think that's a really important piece that youth can do. It just is harder. It takes more intention. It takes more deliberation.
Actually, I have a new story that is more relevant to our topic today of conflict resolution. And this is actually a story that dates back to my middle school and elementary years. I don't know, is one of the most densely populated African-American cities in the country. And for me, all of my peers looked like me. So growing up, I kind of grew up in a bubble in a sense. And from kindergarten through 6th grade, I went to school in the city of Gary until finally, after my 6th grade year, my parents decided, all right, we see you kind of veering down the wrong path. We're gonna take you outside of the Gary school system and send you into a school in the suburbs. So here I am, like a 12, 13-year-old kid who had never been around any other kids that pretty much weren't Black or Hispanic. And I'm at a K through 8 school, and there were less than 10 Black students in the whole school. So for me, this was a total culture shock, and it was hard to adjust. I can remember when I first got there, I didn't know how to interact. I didn't know how to speak with the other students, and I had a real hard time fitting in. And on top of that, I can remember vividly in my head, it was December 17th, 1993 was the year was the day my grandmother passed. And I can remember coming downstairs. It was the day before Christmas break was going to start. And my mom saying to me, say goodbye to grandma. And my grandmother had fallen sick the night before. I was afraid to go in there and disturb her. So I left the house without saying goodbye to grandma. And as we pulled up that next day, I can remember seeing pieces of her bed being taken out of the house by a moving truck, and knowing that I missed my opportunity to say my final goodbye. So not only was I going through the conflict of having lost my grandmother, I was going through the conflict of not being able to fit in. And one day everything just boiled over when I was walking through the hall and one of my classmates bumped into me, and he used a racial slur in reference to me. Next thing I knew, I tackled him. We were on the ground, we were rolling around, we were fighting, and there was a circle of kids around us. And to this day, the song they started chanting rings in my head. They started to clap their hands and go, fight, fight, a Black and a white, fight, fight, a Black and a white. Me to pull back even further to the point where I would go home in tears. And I would tell my parents, I don't want to go to this school anymore. I don't want to be around these students anymore. They're not my friends. I'll never be able to interact with them. My parents calmed me down and said, okay, take a breath, take a step back. Maybe once basketball season starts up, you'll make some friends through sports. Basketball season started up, things didn't get any better. To make matters worse, my mom fell sick shortly after that. She had to quit her job, and we were informed that we would have to be moving to Cleveland for several weeks. My mom went into the Cleveland Clinic where she had open heart surgery. And my dad told my coach that I'd be leaving and I'd have to miss practice for up to a month, but I'd be back once everything had settled over. Long story short, I returned back after being in Cleveland for about a month. My mom had successful surgery, she recovered, and I still felt that gap between me and my peers. And I didn't really even want to play basketball. I didn't want to be a part of the school, but I'll never forget that first day I walked into practice after returning from Cleveland, and one of my teammates, the same individual, in fact, that had called me out of my name by that racial slur earlier in the school year, came up to me before practice started and had a ball signed by the entire team and presented it to me and said, hey man, we're all a team, we're all family, we're glad your mom's okay. And to this day, that ball is in my trophy case at my dad's house. And it showed me that you know, conflict can be resolved in a number of ways, but what we need to really understand is that we're all individuals. When you think of someone, everybody has a mother, everyone has a father, no matter what your relationship is with them. And once you break it down on a grassroots level like that, you can begin to have understanding. Being mentally resilient, having the power to bounce back. Young minds and the young spirit is very malleable, And I believe that the kids cannot allow themselves to be influenced and pulled down the wrong direction. And at times when they might feel afraid or alone, they need to always remember that there's power within, and tap into that power within, and channel that energy to help bring out the ability to overcome. Some other obstacles I faced in my life was the moment when I broke my neck at age 22. And they told me I might not ever walk. The surgeon told me I might not ever walk again. I refused to believe that. And I tapped into that power within. And while everyone might not break their neck, we'll all go through hardships and we'll all go through difficulties where someone will tell you you can't do anything. And the important thing is to just tap into that inner strength and know that you can overcome anything that anyone doubts you on.
I would say the way that I feel how conflict relates to social justice is, like we talked about earlier, and like Ed just talked about, was being in like an area where he had never been before, where he was just like introduced to being around kids who weren't Black and who weren't Hispanic. I would say that a lot of the times part of conflict is because of like certain racial reasons and stuff like that.
I can absolutely follow that. I think Emmanuel's right on with, being in a space where things such as race and gender, social justice and civil rights, and then you bring in right and wrong. Now we're working with two things. We're working with, social justice and conflict, and they're very much intertwined. And so I think when you have to not only justify right and wrong, but you're also protecting your identity, or you're standing up for the color of your skin, or your gender, it makes it much more difficult for all sides to feel heard, as they should be.
Protests have been taking place around the country and globally, with people speaking out about George Floyd and the killings of others at the hands of law enforcement. A recent trend has been for police officers to kneel with the protesters, which has caused some conflict for Black and Brown communities who either think it's a good way to bridge communities, while others see it as pandering. In your opinion, is this seen as a good step in conflict resolution, or does it send the wrong message to protesters? And what are other approaches that can be more supportive of protesters in instances like these? Anyone can get started.
Go ahead and get started. Actually, in relation to the kneeling, while it's a start, I believe that more of a dialogue needs to be created. I have a story I can share that kind of ties into this. As a child, oftentimes when I was young, before my mother got sick, if there wasn't a sitter during summer vacation, I would go and stay with her at the office while she worked. And when we had lunch hour, I would eat lunch downstairs with an elderly gentleman who was very polite, who was always open to sharing life stories with me, and it never failed. He always treated me to lunch. And it wasn't until years later I found out that that elderly gentleman who my mom set up for me to have lunch with was actually a homeless man. What that showed me was that even though my mother was in a position where she was the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce in our town, she treated each individual she encountered, whether it was this homeless man to a mayor to a state senator, with the same level of respect and politeness that she did across the board. There was no difference. And one thing that we could do as a society is, instead of kneeling, sit down amongst one another, listen actively to each other, and take these progressive steps toward a working conclusion to where we all have harmony together.
Edward's right on with kneeling is the first step, but I think within conflict resolution, it's difficult when you when you see the police force kneel, but then you don't see steps taken afterwards. And so is that really a form of conflict resolution? Is that really a form of solidarity? Or is that something to relieve in the moment, but not have any steps forward? And so I think exactly what Edward said, you know, if it's not just kneeling, let's all sit, let's all have that dialogue, let's all sit at the table together, would more signify a resolution than necessarily just kneeling. And I think for communities in which may not see the kneeling appropriate, I think that's fair, because there aren't necessarily steps happening post kneeling. And symbolically, I think there's times when something like that completely can be a form of conflict resolution and can be a form of communicating with another group. And I think there's a time and a place. And so I think it's a nice gesture, but I don't think it's enough.
As I was preparing for this question, knowing it was coming, I almost verbatim what was already shared is what I wrote down. I think it can be a good initial gesture, but it needs to be followed by dialogue, and then it needs to be followed by action and changes of behavior, and which comes out of that dialogue, right? That's where people become motivated to change based on like my experience seen and what research has shown, right, in other situations. So it can be a good gesture, right? It can be an act of solidarity, but if it's not followed by anything, I don't know if it is effective when you're looking at it from a conflict resolution perspective.
So definitely, I agree with everybody else said. It is a step towards where I feel like we need to go. But like Katie said, it also is something else that we need, because I feel like as people, we're looking for a little bit more from like the police officers and stuff like that. So I feel as if maybe like a chief or something could come out and speak about it. Because at the end of the day, let's just say they do take a knee. It's like at the end of the day, if nothing changes, it's like, what's the point of taking a knee? So like everybody said, we need to see actions behind it.
Okay.
YODJ, which is our Youth Online Discussing Justice, is our normal discussion series that would happen in schools, but it's online due to COVID. So we utilize a very similar curriculum that we would utilize in schools, but we're doing it in a format on Zoom. And so we've seen very similar results to what we see in schools. And the main focus of YODJ is to create space for conversations just like this. Create space for specifically youth to amplify their voices. I think one thing that EYEJ really does a great job with is, one, bringing together diverse individuals. And one thing we talked about with conflict resolution is everyone has their own perspective. Everyone is their own person. And so having these conversations in a space with diverse individuals that you may have never met before, that this is your first time meeting on Zoom, is extremely powerful to allow that space to not only be safe to share, but to gain perspective, gain new understandings, and then move forward in your everyday life with action steps and ways that we can take, for example, conflict resolution tools and utilize it every day. And so for our youth, having this space to be open and to ask these questions that may not be allowed or they may not have other space to do so, whether it's at their house or in their group of friends, but they're here with a group of people that we're all here being vulnerable together, allows that space to do its justice. And so I know that was your first question. Then what was your second question regarding?
What are some of the benefits that you are seeing in the youth being served currently with EYEJ?
No, absolutely. I think one thing that we are seeing is, specifically because within our curriculum and within our conversations, really try and come forward with actionable steps. when we meet with our students again and we reflect on how you've utilized those things in your everyday life. So have you been in conflict in the last few days, and what have you taken away from it? So I think what we're really seeing is them taking these skills and utilizing it every day and thinking about and reflecting on the conversations. Because our programming is 12 weeks long, every Monday and Wednesday, that allows that opportunity for growth over a period of time. It also allows us to check in with them and to come back to what we were talking about, so that we can really take those tools and build habits, build skills that they can take with them beyond this 12-week discussion series.
I have a short list, well, somewhat short. The first book, which just shows strength and grit and resilience, and this was a book I read in my late teens, which really had a defining moment in my life, is the autobiography of Assata Shakur. It just shows how she had to overcome various odds, from being arrested. Another book that I read before that even that had a strong impact on my life was The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. And it's just the story of a young man on a journey. And I think every young man or young woman is going through a journey in life, and they need some sort of direction. And that book kind of gives you that inspiration and motivation to walk down the right path. Another book, which is more recent, is a book called The Miracle Morning. And that's by an author named Hal Elrod. And it just shows you how to get into a ritual or a morning routine that sets your day up for success. And the last book, most recent book that I have read that I can add to this list is Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. And if you haven't heard of him or heard his story, it's pretty incredible. He's a guy that went from 300 pounds and wanting to be a Navy SEAL to losing 100 pounds in a matter of months, going on to become a Navy SEAL, and then after that, becoming a world record holder and also a ultra marathoner. And I do have two video series you can, one video, if you YouTube search, there's a video by U.S. Navy Admiral William McRaven, and it's called It Starts With Making Your Bed. And it's a speech he gave which breaks down how the simple act of making your bed in the morning can set your day up for success. Also, if you search on YouTube, E3 Motivates, my series 1 Minute Motivation, there are 35 episodes, small 1 minute, and those can give you inspiration. Just put it on repeat, little bite-sized chunks.
If you are a passive person and fearful of confrontation, what is the best way to approach conflict?
Here's what I would do is I would encourage you to think about why you're tentative to engage conflict. What about it is uncomfortable for you? Personally, part of how I got into the field that I'm in is because I was conflict avoidant. I was very passive. I'm 35 years old, but it wasn't until my early 20s that I made a decision that I can't be passive my whole life. And part of that was because I was seeing, I got into this field because I saw social injustice. And I became passionate about it while I was in college, right after high school. And that's when I made a conscious decision that I wasn't just gonna sit by. I was gonna force myself to learn skills and knowledge to be able to engage conflict in a constructive way and not be afraid of it. And it's been over 10 years of deliberate work, learning, reading good books. A couple of the books that Edward recommended, I highly endorse because I've read them. The Alchemist has been a foundational part of my journey, right? Among others. And I think first part is recognizing that you're uncomfortable with conflict, and then being able to say, okay, conflict is not in and of itself a bad thing. And encouraging yourself to be able to step into it a little bit and be okay with the discomfort. And as someone that studies like adult development psychology, it's in those uncomfortable situations where we grow the most, right? And so challenging yourself to, it doesn't have to be all at once. It can be, okay, next time I'm gonna try to engage and be deliberate in having a conversation that I normally would completely avoid, right? Small steps go a long way when you look at how we grow over the course of time. So feel free. I'll share my email if you want to talk. I'll share my phone number if people want to talk about like ways to become more comfortable and develop some skills for dealing with conflict more effectively. Like that's what I do. I work at Tri-C teaching that stuff, right? And it takes time. It takes time, but you can start now, especially for youth right now. Like you can start to be intentional about being more assertive and being okay with the discomfort. And that's where you can start. But it's also okay to be passive on occasion. It's okay to pick your battles, right? So I'm not telling you you have to, right? Right? I'm just encouraging you to recognize why you're uncomfortable in certain situations and challenging yourself to speak up a little bit more on occasion. And over the course of time, with deliberate practice and intentional practice, you can grow in your comfort around having those difficult conversations and being in conflict.
As an athlete, one thing I often heard was the expression, get comfortable being uncomfortable. And I think the same can be said emotionally. If you get comfortable having those uncomfortable conversations, then you can begin to grow emotionally and you won't veer away from them so much.
You have to learn to love like that certain type of failure. Like I would say, like, let's just say you get into a conflict and it doesn't go so well, you could learn from it, like Ty said, and next time you know what to do, you know what to say, you know how to handle it.
As a young Black man, is conflict resolution harder when racism is the issue?
I would say personally, yes, and personally, no. Reason I would say that is somewhat hard is just because of, like as a Black man, you have so much things that you have to deal with constantly. So constantly bogged down with worrying about this, worrying about your life, stuff like that.
Okay, great. Could you talk more about how trauma intersects this development of emotional intelligence?
And feel free to join in for other people too. Trauma definitely impacts like our development of emotional intelligence. And it's partially because when we have experienced trauma, as I'm sure many of us have to varying degrees, we want to protect ourselves, right? Subconsciously, our brains, our minds respond to protect ourselves. And so it's harder for us to be sometimes more in tune to others when we need to protect ourselves. And if we have, residual trauma and trauma that is built up that we don't address, it can continue to impact our ability to like grow in our emotional intelligence. And it shows up in conflict all the time as well. People that have, there's a lot of research on how people that have experienced trauma are more reactionary. They don't have the capacity to listen and engage the discomfort and the uncomfortable conflict, because it's a protection reaction, right? And so it does play in there. There's a lot of ways to overcome that, but every single situation is different too. So that's just a brief couple of words.
Can anybody suggest a good podcast that speaks about overcoming challenges and conflicts in one's life?
I don't know specifically, but a few podcasts I listen to that bring on individuals that have overcome things in their life are The Secret to Success. Oh, no, actually, the School of Greatness podcast by Lewis Howes. He's a former athlete who he brings on various individuals who have been through different elements in their life that have been hard to overcome. That's a good one. Impact Theory is another good one. And also School of Greatness, Impact Theory, and Ed Milet has a podcast as well. And his podcast brings on individuals that have overcome a lot in their life as well.
I can't think of like any specific podcasts that focus on that on a regular basis, but there are a bunch of, episodes from different people's podcasts that address that.
Yeah.
So I think like I have a list of podcasts that I could share, from some that deal with like how do women in organizations deal with conflict and how's that different than men, and providing insights. There's a couple of like Freakonomics podcast episodes that talk about what happens in the brain. And there's a handful of others, but not one. I don't have any like one podcast that I could recommend, but I could share some links to specific episodes that would be helpful for people.
So life with little conflict is boring. How much conflict do we need and still be constructive? I think it's an important question because conflict has a negative connotation generally, and people avoid conflict. We're not very confrontational. So how do we think of it as something that would be constructive and healthy?
My immediate thought is, like Ty said earlier, like some conflicts are good. Sometimes it's good to have to think differently and have a new perspective on something. I think conflict becomes an issue when it is forming or impacting or contributing to toxic stress. So if you're having conflict all the time, every day, one, you're not going to be able to handle conflict well. And two, at that point, you're not learning things from it. Partly because you just don't have the capacity to do so. And partly because when you're having conflict, like when you have anything at too high, if too much, you're not able to kind of take that step back in which would allow you to walk away with something from it. So I think like I said, when you're at the point where you're having conflict, where it's causing stress in your life because you're constantly in conflict, whether it's with a person, organization, a group of people, that can be really stressful.
I mean, I totally echo and support what Katie just shared. Conflict takes a toll on us, right? And so I think different people have different levels of capacity for dealing with conflict. And knowing what our limits are is really important. Being self-aware and recognizing when we can't take anymore, that it's time to step back and do whatever you need to like, whether it's watch a show on Netflix or go on a walk or play some basketball with some friends. Like, we need that mental break because conflict really takes a toll on us. There's no like simple equation for like what is a constructive amount, right? But I will say that over time, as we develop our competencies and our capacities to deal with conflict, we are able to now deal with more, right, and constructively. And so I think just being mindful of that is like, there is a fine line between what is constructive and then what is unhealthy. One other thing I really wanted to touch on real quick that's kind of going off a little bit, but I don't think we have any questions in the hopper right now. So is we talk a lot about conflict resolution. And one of the things I want to challenge people to think about is resolving conflict always the best approach? In my work there and the field that I deal with, there are lots of different approaches to conflict. Sometimes it is managed, sometimes it is resolved, sometimes it is escalated, like what we're seeing right now in communities with these nonviolent protests and this civil uprising, right? We're escalating conflict to bring attention to injustice. And I think that is a really constructive use of conflict, is when we can escalate it in order to show where injustice is occurring. And so right now, I think it's really cool to see our communities being okay with the discomfort and escalation of conflict to bring attention to these, injustices, whether it's structural violence or systemic racism, and calling them out, right? And that brings me to my final point, is like there's this concept called conflict transformation. And conflict transformation is like this process of engaging and transforming relationships and interests and our discourse, and ultimately changing the systems that we're a part of. And that requires an escalation of conflict. And I think we're at this time in our communities, I know we're in different states, some of us, right? But in Cleveland, in California, in Washington, DC, we're at this point where people are starting to escalate conflict to bring attention to the injustices that are occurring, with the hope that this process can lead towards some type of transformation in the way that we communicate in our systems and structures here in the United States and elsewhere. So I think it's important to note that conflict resolution is not always the best option in the moment. Sometimes we need to escalate conflict. Sometimes we can deal with it in a transformational way. Maybe sometimes it needs to be managed. My personal opinion is avoiding violence at all costs, but conflict doesn't have to include violence. We're seeing it.
One key takeaway about conflict resolution that comes to me is probably intention in solving it. So how do we de-escalate? How can we step away from a second, especially for our students? How are we teaching our youth to intentionally deal with conflict?
Really just, like I mentioned earlier, get comfortable being uncomfortable and be able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes before drowning them out with your point of view or screams or shouts. Try to see things from their point of view and come to a common goal or common ground with them together. That's my 2 cents there.
Takeaways that I hope everybody take away is to learn from your failures, and also I would say to respect the differences from each other.